Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Venable's Trade Policy under a Second Trump Administration, Tariffs, Tools, and International Impact. I'm Will Nordwind. I am a partner and co-chair of Venable's Legislative and Government Affairs Group, and I'll be joined today by my partners, Ashley Craig and Liz Lowe, who are in our International Trade and Logistics Group, and Nick Choate, who is a fellow Legislative and Government Affairs Senior Policy Advisor here at Venable. Next slide. So this is our third in a series of Venable's Navigating Policy Shifts under a Second Trump Administration series. And we're looking ahead to a new political state of affairs coming with the second Trump presidency and new Congress beginning in January. And through this series of webinars, we'll be exploring how these leadership transitions, executive actions, and congressional dynamics will shape the future of industries ranging from healthcare and financial services to energy, today, trade, and beyond. Each of these in a series, this is our third so far, will feature analysis from Venable attorneys and senior policy advisors. And we look forward to today's presentation and those in the future. And at the end, we'll have a schedule of the upcoming future webinars that will continue on into January. So next slide, please. So I want to tip it over to Ashley Craig, who is chairman of Venable's International Trade and Logistics Group, to walk us through today's agenda.
Thank you, Will, and welcome everyone. I second my partner and colleagues' comments in terms of how important this is for all of us. And obviously, trade has been an issue that has dominated not only the campaign, but now into the transition. And today, we're going to look at a variety of different aspects and try to tie it home in a very practical way. What does it mean to U.S. concerns, importers, exporters, those involved in international commerce? So in front of you is an agenda. We're going to toggle back and forth just to kind of set the stage between the four of us that are on site. And we're going to have folks lead a discussion, but from time to time, we'll all chime in. I'm very happy to say that we brought to you today a very diverse group of folks. My partner, Liz Lowe, who is in the trade group, as well as Nick, and will provide a political angle that frankly is very important in this discussion. So we're going to take a look at what options the Trump administration, the new Trump administration, has when it comes to trade policy and in particular tariff actions. A lot of discussion being had, a lot of comments, at least on the campaign trail, being made by then candidate Trump. Also timing of these actions and what that means for the new White House. Options for U.S. importers and exporters. Liz will walk you through some very meaningful and we hope very practical alternatives to consider if you're not already doing so. We will also take a look at other trade-related issues so that we don't get too caught up on the tariff discussion. And then also a holistic consideration of what this means from the new Congress. We have a razor-thin GOP majority on the House side and a slightly larger, but not that significant margin on the Senate side. So it'll be interesting to see what both chambers have to say when it comes to trade policy being driven by the Trump White House. Timing, what does this mean as we look forward to the Jan 20 inauguration and the new administration being stood up? Consideration of what a Trump cabinet may mean for Trump policy. And I believe that our team has allotted about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. So having said all that, Ashton, if we could to the next slide, I'm going to hand it over to Liz Lowe. But before I do that, I think it's important to know we haven't had a lot of actual public-facing comments coming out of the transition team when it comes to trade and tariff actions. We have a tweet that was released, or I should say, an online posting on social media by the president-elect before the Thanksgiving holiday, which talked about imposing across-the-board tariffs on our friends in Canada, as well as in Mexico, 25% on anything and everything, which raises questions about USMCX, NAFTA 2.0. We'll talk about that in a bit. The president-elect also mentioned an additional 10% being imposed on existing tariffs with regards to the People's Republic of China, PRC. That has been most of the commentary that we've heard out of the president-elect himself. Although he recently did announce that if the so-called BRIC countries, which go back to the early 2010s or so, and that, of course, is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the emerging economies. If they were to pursue another type of currency, new currency, they could face up to 100% tariffs from the new administration. Now, this is the most recent set of comments coming out of the president-elect, and it has sent, as you might imagine, some ripples through the BRIC community, setting aside Russia for obvious reasons. That's something to keep an eye on, and we're following it as closely as we can. So with that backdrop, Liz is going to walk us through what the president has available. And if I'm not mistaken, Liz, this slide is yours. If I have that wrong, let me know. Otherwise, it's over to you. Thanks.
Next slide, please, Ashton. I think you covered this one, Ashley. Thank you. So as Ashley and Will have mentioned, there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding tariffs, such as which countries, what products will be impacted, at what rate, and for how long they will be in effect. There is one thing, though, that is fairly certain, and that is that we will see additional tariffs of some form during the second Trump administration. Trump has several different legal vehicles on which he can rely to impose those tariffs. The next few slides will cover key points about those different tariff vehicles. They're divided into three sections: tariff vehicles that had been previously used during his first administration, existing legislation that can be used to impose tariffs, and then briefly touch on potential new legislation. Next slide, please, Ashton. Okay, so starting with previously used tariff vehicles. The first is Section 301 of the Trade Act, and this is for relief from unfair trade practices. This was the basis for the China tariffs implemented during Trump's first administration. Those remain largely in effect and range from 7.5 to 25%. Under Section 301, USTR must initiate an investigation prior to implementing tariffs. There is a notice and comment period that is required as well, so it is a longer process. During Trump's first administration, the first two lists of tariffs took approximately 11 months to implement. The third and fourth lists were implemented more quickly, in part because USTR relied on previously submitted comments as opposed to opening a new notice and comment period. These lists are the subject of an ongoing litigation. Making changes to the existing Section 301 tariffs is an option that Trump has. He could potentially, like they did with lists 3 and 4, rely on previously submitted comments to have a faster process. Again, though, those would likely face legal challenges. Another vehicle that was used during his first administration is Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. This provides for response to imports that impair national security. This was the basis for the current steel and aluminum tariffs. Section 232, again, requires an investigation, this time by Commerce. There is no notice and comment period, but the whole process tends to take 11 to 12 months. Trump could modify the existing Section 232 tariffs with no notice or comment period. So that is an option he has to act relatively quickly. Finally, Section 201 of the Trade Act, that is for temporary safeguards to remediate import injury to a domestic industry. Section 201 was the basis for the current solar cell and module tariffs and the previous tariffs and TRQs on washing machines. Again, an investigation is required, this time by ITC. There is also a notice and comment period, so you're looking at approximately 8 months. There is no notice and comment period required to modify existing tariffs on solar cell and modules, but an extension of those tariffs would require notice and comment period. So bottom line here for the previously used tariff vehicles, you're looking at 8 to 11 months. to get new tariffs in place under those sections. Relatively easy for Trump to modify the existing Section 301, 232, and 201 tariffs, but that will have limited effect and is likely to be subject to legal challenges.
Hey, Liz,
Next slide.
if I may, I know you're still going through options. So I'll tee it up and you can address it when you're done walking through remaining statutory authority that the president has. But there's been a lot of discussion, questions about how broadly the Trump administration may apply tariffs. Obviously, there's been a focus on China now, our friends north and south of the border. But I'm sure that the audience is curious as to our combined speculation as to how aggressive the president may very well be in terms of applying tariffs across the board. Just something to tee up for all of us, actually.
Thanks, Ashley. So this slide presents a couple of existing options that could be used to implement tariffs. And to Ashley's point, I'll sort of address how these might be used, in particular IEEPA. Starting with sort of more traditional tariff legislation, Section 122 of the Trade Act. This was not used by Trump during the first administration. It is available to address balance of payments. So if there is a fundamental international payments problem, and then either a large and serious U.S. balance of payment deficit or imminent and significant dollar depreciation, or a balance of payments disequilibrium, that is when this option can be used. There are a few sort of significant drawbacks to tariffs under 122 for Trump. One is that he's limited in how high the tariffs can go. There's a maximum of 15%, and they only apply for 150 days. Now, they can be extended by Congress, but because of that cap on the amount and the time, the temporary nature of them, they're less likely to be as effective from a negotiating standpoint as some other tariffs might be. One that is not on here that I just wanted to flag also is Section 338 of the Tariff Act. That allows for tariffs when there is a discrimination of U.S. commerce by foreign countries. This has rarely, if ever, been used. So I don't think there's a high likelihood of it being used here, but that does allow the president to pretty swiftly implement tariffs of up to 50% when they find that unreasonable or discriminatory actions have been taken by a country that disadvantage U.S. commerce. So that is also an option that's out there. Turning now to IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This I'm going to spend a little bit of time on, and to Ashley's point, I think a lot of comments lately from Trump have indicated that he will likely use IEEPA to implement some, if not several, tariffs pretty quickly after taking office. So IEEPA is the law that is used to implement economic sanctions. So our sanctions against Cuba, Russia, Iran, all of those sanctions programs are implemented under IEEPA. IEEPA has never been used to implement tariffs in the past, but it provides a very broad authority to the U.S. president to regulate imports and take any other steps or other steps in response to an emergency involving an unusual and extraordinary threat, which has its source in whole or in substantial part outside of the U.S. And that's a threat to national security, foreign policy, or the economy. In the 70s, Nixon implemented a 10% across the board tariff based on the Trading with the Enemy Act, which is a predecessor law to IEEPA. Again, based on Trump's comments during his first administration with regards to Mexico, and then comments recently, which Ashley mentioned earlier, threatening 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, an additional 10% on China, frankly, even the threatened 100% on the BRIC nations if they proceed with de-dollarization. strongly indicate that IEEPA is the vehicle that would be used to implement those tariffs.
Liz, if I may, just one quick point on that. My recollection was that IEEPA was not officially used, but that President Trump during the first term did invoke it in terms of getting our friends in Mexico to the table to further reconsideration of NAFTA, which eventually led to USMCX. But there was no action ultimately taken. So that coupled with what I understand, we have a USTR nominee in Jamison Greer, who, as I understand, is very much of the school of thought that these are all tools in the toolbox, that tariffs can be effective, but he sees them more as leverage against our trading partners. So to your point, I agree with you. I think IEEPA is going to be front and center in terms of at least, quote, threatening to use it as this new administration has stood up in the not too distant future.
Yes, so as I noted that there was the threat against Mexico last time to use IEEPA specifically for the migrant crisis. In order for IEEPA to be used here, so it's not bound by the same procedural requirements that apply for Section 301, 232, and 201, frankly, any of the other options, really. The president has to declare a national emergency, which he can do pretty quickly. I think we would anticipate a national emergency with regards to the migrant crisis, and then potentially a national emergency with regards to fentanyl, opioid crisis. That would provide the coverage that Trump needs to implement tariffs under IEEPA against Canada, Mexico, and China. What I think is going to be interesting about the use of IEEPA, again, not having been used previously in this way, is that the tariffs could apply differently than what we are used to seeing with traditional tariffs. So, as I'm sure everyone on the line is well aware, the tariffs that are currently in place, they apply based on country of origin of the product. So even if something's exported from China, if based on applying the applicable rules of origin, the country of origin of that product is actually Thailand or Vietnam or Malaysia, then that product's not subject to the Section 301 tariffs because it is not a product of Chinese origin. Under IEEPA, it's possible that the tariffs could apply based on country of export in addition to or in lieu of country of origin. That is more in line with how sanctions apply, generally speaking, right? So I think we have to look at this a little bit through more of a sanctions lens. Another question that has come up and I think is unclear is whether programs such as like duty drawback will be applicable if the tariffs are imposed under IEEPA. We know that you could get duty drawback for Section 301 tariffs, but whether you could under a different structure is unclear. I think the bottom line here for this slide is that IEEPA in particular can be used very quickly with little check on the president's actions because they are based on national security. I think, as Ashley mentioned, I think we share the feeling that this is likely to be the basis of some tariffs, in particular those that he is trying to implement quickly at the beginning of his administration. I'm sure that there will be legal challenges to that, and whether there is a shift once he is in office to using more traditional tariff vehicles, that's yet to be seen. But how tariffs under IEEPA are implemented, applied, and enforced is new ground. So it is going to be very important for folks to stay on top of not only the executive orders as they come out, but also any agency guidance that expands on those in order to understand how those tariffs are going to apply. Before moving to the next slide, I know there was a question about what constitutes modification of a tariff. And when I'm referring to modification, it's primarily an increase or decrease in the duty rate for tariffs that are already in existence. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so for completeness, it is possible that Congress could enact new legislation that could be used as a tariff vehicle. For example, Trump frequently stated during his campaign that he plans to use tariff revenue to fund tax cuts. So tariffs would be included in the tax bill. I think this is overall unlikely, and I will let Nick get into this on the next slide and sort of talk about it from a process perspective. But just in general, tariffs that are codified into law become much less effective as a negotiating tool for Trump. So I anticipate that being less appealing. Also, Congress could introduce new bills that provide new tariff authority. There are two bills that were introduced in the current Congress that would do that. The first would essentially allow for the imposition of reciprocal retaliatory tariffs. And the second would allow Trump to influence the development of a new tariff schedule for China. Again, these would need to be reintroduced in the new Congress, go through the normal legislative process. And before I hand it over to Nick, just to provide further thoughts on legislation and the legislative process, the CLE code for this webinar is International 2024. Nick, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Liz. Sorry, it took me a minute to find my unmute button. We can, and actually, let's stay on this slide for just a second, because I'll start with kind of where Liz left off on the likelihood of legislation being used as a vehicle. I think, as most, if not all, are aware, like a top priority of the new Republican majorities in Congress, as well as the Trump administration, is a large tax bill sometime this year. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017 that were arguably the signature legislative accomplishment of Trump's first term in office expire next year. So there is an effort to renew those. The cost to do that, assuming they change nothing else and just extend them for another 10 years, you're talking about a price tag around $4 trillion. So they are looking for every penny they can find to offset at least some of that cost. That is clearly a price tag that no legislation has ever approached. And given, current deficits, total federal debt, and narrow Republican majorities, that will be a very hard pill to swallow if they can't find a way to pay for it. I think there are varying estimates out there, but even the most aggressive Trump tariff proposals, I think if you were to, as this slide notes, like, you need to write them into the bill and get a CBO score on them in order to actually get credit for that, proper congressional credit for them as a pay for. But I think in the most ambitious world, you're talking just north of $2.5 trillion out of a $4 trillion package. So, and again, those would be the most aggressive tariffs Trump has talked about, no exceptions, which politically just does not seem likely, which brings us back to kind of the top of this slide. The likelihood of legislation being used to actually enact tariffs seems low at this point. But we do want to mention it because it is a possibility, and Congress needs money, and they don't like raising taxes, IRS tax code taxes, but tariffs might be more appealing to some. We can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Hey, Nick, can I ask a question along those lines? I'm sure that folks on the audience are well aware that for years now, we've had a statutory framework for the advancement of temporary duty suspension. Before that, it was all done kind of ad hoc. And this went on for decades and decades in terms of getting, again, temporary duty suspension legislation in place. And the factors were more or less the same in the sense that you did you needed to zero in. No U.S. domestic industry would object to it, et cetera, et cetera. And it usually was a ceiling of about $500,000 in terms of the duty impact. That was all overhauled several years ago. There's an actual piece of statutory authority that Congress is supposed to follow. That has been stuck for a long time now. Speculation, I'll tip it to you. Is it safe to say that notwithstanding the miscellaneous trade and tariff statute, that this new administration is not going to push for any sort of temporary duty suspension, given all of the focus on imposing new tariffs?
I think that's right, Ashley. Like that's my gut. Like, I mean, that is not something they have talked about. But to your point, the fact that it has been stuck, and given where the incoming administration is on trade generally, like I can't imagine that being a priority.
Thanks. I thought that's what you would say.
But can't say that's something I've looked into recently. So just a gut response on that one.
Thank you.
Okay, so not to rewind, but I think Liz or Ashley one mentioned earlier, like given the campaign rhetoric and action from his first term, Trump has to do something early on trade and tariffs. I think the question is, what is that and when does it happen? And, as Liz outlined, like there are a number of like vehicles and procedures that could take, but they have to do something. And what sorry, I'm catching up on this slide here. I think there are political factors here too. You have, what Trump campaigned on, which is widely, I should say widely popular with the general public from a populist standpoint. Like there's no harm in being anti-China right now, particularly on China tariffs. I'll single those out for a second. Even President Biden coming in after Trump left most of his China tariffs and policies in place, and in fact, expanded on and built on those in some places. So I think especially when it comes to China and trade, this is not a Democratic Republican issue. This is one where the president might actually find some at least rhetorical bipartisan support from Democrats in Congress, and certainly among the American public. I think with the business community is where the rubber meets the road and the practical impact that has on people. And that is where I think you start to lose even Republicans in Congress. Like it's one thing to say you're tough on China, but when the practical impacts of that start hitting bottom lines and jobs, I think it makes these guys rethink some of the specifics and makes it harder to potentially codify some of these things. We've talked about using tariffs as a pay for a tax bill, and to do that the legitimate way with a CBO score and all is one thing. I think what they're more likely to do is write their tax bill and then say, hey, look over here at these tariffs that President Trump is implementing. This will help offset it. And it might not get you actual credit in that CBO score on a line item basis. But from a messaging standpoint, I think it helps Republicans in Congress say they're at least partially paying for these things with tariffs. So rather than codifying things, I think that's where they go. I looked it up the other day. The Congressional Research Service has a report from October of this year. And just to kind of give you a sense, I mean, I talked about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act being a $4 trillion extension over the course of 10 years. The federal budget is approaching $7 trillion a year. And because of Trump's tariff policies in his first term, he nearly doubled tariff revenue collection from FY15 to FY20 from, $37 billion to $74 billion. So sorry, I don't have a graph for you here, but 74 billion compared to 4 trillion is a pebble in a lake at best. So the idea that they're going to turn to tariffs to, fully pay for this thing seems far-fetched. I think we can go to the next slide. So where does that leave us with the political considerations? Again, messaging wise, tariffs very popular, but the specifics matter a lot, particularly in Congress and to many of you. We would expect a very robust exceptions or exclusions process for any tariff proposal coming from Trump, which again might favor executive action over congressional. It's less clear what kind of exclusion or exception process there might be if Congress were to just statutorily enact new tariffs. Last time around, there were tens of thousands of exception requests. And I think that is where you see members of Congress start to weigh in. While Congress certainly could step in and reverse Trump tariffs or codify Trump tariffs, the political will does not seem to be there, particularly given the narrow majorities. So from a congressional standpoint, I think we are of the opinion, most of my colleagues at least, that the most you're likely to see from Congress is statements, letters of support, letters of opposition, those sorts of things. And this really will be driven by the administration and the executive branch. They're not telling you anything you don't know here probably, but even U.S. companies, U.S.-based companies with tens or even hundreds of thousands of employees, if they're still heavily reliant on China for their supply chain, the sympathy for those models is really waning politically on both sides of the aisle. I think there's a belief that, maybe not a respect for the practical realities of what it takes to reconfigure a supply chain, but I think going back to the beginning of COVID, a lot of folks are of the opinion that companies have had time to adjust, and if they're still reliant on China, well, that maybe is their problem. Again, not my personal opinion, just saying, politically, there seems to be a lot of movement in that direction. And then, we've talked about China a lot, but I'll bring it back to even Mexico and Canada. You post-election, you're starting to see even some, I won't say a lot, but some Democrats praise Trump's notion of imposing tariffs on at least certain goods from Mexico and Canada. And, those are largely things that impact their districts or states directly, where they're looking out for an industry or a particular union. But this is not a place where you're going to see wholesale opposition to the idea of tariffs on key trading partners from the opposition party. I do think the incoming administration is going to have a lot of leeway here. And Congress is pretty much going to let them do what they want. I think on that, sorry, my slides are.
Thanks, Nick. I think the next slide, we go back to Liz.
Yeah, sorry. I fell behind. Yes, back to you, Liz and/or Ashley.
Thanks, Nick. So just coming back to some other considerations for tariffs, and I know there have been a lot of questions that have come in. Some of them will be addressed on this slide. So first is the layering of tariffs. It's important to keep in mind that the different types of tariffs are not exclusive. So a product can be subject to multiple different tariffs. For example, the proposal from Trump to add an additional 10% tariff on goods from China, again, presumably via IEEPA, that would be on top of the existing Section 301 tariffs, potentially also on top of Section 232 tariffs. So these can layer on top of one another, which can help Trump get towards his statements about applying 60% for China, for example. Another thing to flag, and there was a question that came in on this, is that Trump has threatened to rescind most favored nation or permanent normal trade relations status for China. That would mean, if he did that, that would mean that tariffs on all goods from China would increase because they would be subject to the column 2 rates in the harmonized tariff schedule as opposed to column 1. Recently, I think it was early December, China enacted a law that would enable it to retaliate quickly if MFN status is revoked. So I think there's definitely shows that there's potentially some concern in China, at least, that this could move forward. The actual likelihood of MFN status being revoked is somewhat questionable. It would require congressional action. Nick, I don't know if you wanted to just weigh in quickly, or Will, with regards to the potential of congressional action on MFN status.
Yeah, there is a bill in both chambers to do this. It has, I would say, modest support at best at the moment. The chair of the China Select Committee in the House has introduced a bill. Last I looked, he doesn't have any co-sponsors at this point. And then there's a bill in the Senate with a couple of Republicans. So at the moment, this does not seem to have, political tailwinds. Does that mean, is there a world where Congress comes back with some bipartisan compromise half measure? Maybe. I think there's a recognition that the president has, any president, not just President Trump, has significant trade tools available to them, and this sort of nuclear option might not be necessary, and clearly doesn't have broad bipartisan support right now.
So that does sort of lead into the idea of retaliatory tariffs. China applied retaliatory tariffs last time when the Section 301 tariffs went in place. I think we can fully expect them to do the same thing this time. In the time that has passed since the Section 301 tariffs were first put in place, China has diversified its agriculture sources. So China putting retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, primarily ag goods, will not hit China as hard, presumably, as it may have last time. Europe, Canada, and Mexico. So the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has stated that Mexico would put retaliatory tariffs in place, potentially equivalent to those put in place by the U.S. We also understand that various EU leaders have talked about the possibility of putting retaliatory tariffs in place if Trump were to put tariffs on EU products. How Canada will respond is less clear, especially with the resignation yesterday of the finance minister, which was apparently related to disagreements specifically on how to handle the tariff threats from Trump. But I do think that we can expect retaliatory tariffs in some form. Exclusion processes. Nick mentioned this. It seems like there will likely be exclusion processes that are available. There were during the first Trump administration. They were somewhat sporadic, brought back under the Biden administration. But I think we can expect something that allows for exceptions or exclusions. How that works under IEEPA, again, could be different. It could look more like what we see for sanctions. So we could be dealing with general licenses available to the general public, and then also specific licenses that are potentially available. I think Nick mentioned this as well, but working in advance, connecting with your representatives to sort of tee up their support if there is an exception process, that's something that can be done at this point.
Could I just on that point, you hit it right on the head, and I was going to mention it. There was a great piece yesterday in the Wall Street Journal that talked about how CEOs across the spectrum are already lining up, getting in front of the president-elect and his team to try to soften his approach to tariff implications. I would agree with you completely. So those of you that are active either individually, who have folks in Washington that are close to the transition team, or through various stakeholder trade associations, we know that many are already trying to position themselves. Some are even going so far as to consider legal challenges to the tariff actions, which, although potentially viable, are not going to help address the short-term impact. That this will take years. But I would just underscore that we know that Mr. Trump is someone who fancies a sit down and likes to hear an argument and then counter. So right now, I think time well spent is focusing on the transition team. And if you do have a case to be made as to why tariffs should not be applicable to a certain sector, i.e. your interest, make that argument now. And as Liz was saying, the exemption process, which was established 6.5 years ago, helps to set the standard. Zero impact on U.S. domestic industry, no other alternatives overseas. This is a necessity for A, B, C, and D. And there will be a collateral impact on the economy, A, B, C, and D. That's the type of argument you need to be making, either directly through folks here in Washington, such as the fine colleagues in our government relations group, Mr. Nordwin and Mr. Choate, or through trade associations. That's something that you should definitely consider if you're not already doing at this moment. Sorry, Liz, back to you.
That's great. Thank you, Asha. And I think that's a good segue into what can you do to prepare for the tariff impact. These are a few sort of concrete steps that you can consider taking, practical, hopefully, that should serve to mitigate the impact of tariffs. So the first is to amend or update, so amend existing contracts, update contract templates to account for either burden shifting or burden sharing, both up and down the supply chain of any potential tariffs. This is something that we are actively working on with several clients, and it's something that you can do now. Another option, which is obviously not applicable to all industries, it won't work for perishable goods, it won't work necessarily for seasonal goods, but to the extent that you have the capacity, the resources, the space to store things, folks are stockpiling inventory, you can do that. You can bring in goods in advance of January 20th. Shifting sourcing and manufacturing, a lot of folks started doing this already based on the Section 301 tariffs against China. We did see a lot of movement for sourcing and manufacturing. Moving everything domestically, obviously one of the goals of a lot of these tariffs is just to move manufacturing and sourcing back domestic. That's not always possible, but shifting out of higher risk countries like China that are undoubtedly going to be subject to additional tariffs, that's a good step. And then finally, not on the slide, but depending on how the tariffs are applied, we strongly recommend that companies review the tariff classification and the country of origin for your products to see whether there are changes to the product itself or to the product process that can be taken in order to mitigate the tariffs. And then also reviewing the valuation of your products, and in particular, whether the first sale valuation method is available for your products. So those are things to consider, steps to take now, steps to take in early January, Q1, to try to mitigate. We're going to move to non-tariff issues now. I think Ashley's going to take that. And Ashley, maybe before you kick it off, there have been several questions that have come in regarding de minimis and what our thoughts are on whether Trump is going to move forward with the reforms to de minimis that have been proposed by Biden.
So the questions that have come in are quite frankly very insightful, and of course on point to the issues that we've been discussing, and then some. If we can't get to the questions, in all likelihood, we won't be able to get to all of them. We will follow up in writing post-webinar as a team. So I'm also very mindful that we're approaching almost 250, and Mr. Nordwin has a few slides to talk about. So in short, on de minimis, and I think the team shares this view, which is it will be another tool in that toolbox when it comes to putting leverage on China. And because he's tied the threat of 25% tariffs north and south of the border to the fentanyl crisis, I think we're going to see potentially the de minimis issue surfacing with this trade team, and perhaps it being a topic of conversation in terms of revising it downward again. Only time will tell, but my own conjecture is that once the team, meaning the trade team within Trump world, realizes that de minimis is not only a real issue, as the Biden White House has flagged recently, but that it could be used, we will watch very closely the implementation of additional measures that will impact B2C primarily. We'll see how the trade community rallies or doesn't around that. In front of you, and I'll be brief because I do want to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Nordwin, who's been very patiently waiting for us. Clearly, this is a topic that deserves probably more than an hour. We've talked a lot about tariff actions, rightfully so. But there's a lot out there in terms of trade policy that the administration can tap into. So the administration will be inheriting a very strong and robust set of legal, regulatory, and policy frameworks that they can tap into. Again, I keep using the phrase, but it is true. More tools for that toolbox, primarily against China, but stepping back holistically, our entire trading communities around the world. Let us not forget forced labor. So the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, UFLPA, which is relatively new and in the last 2 years has been implemented and enforced primarily by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, remains front and center. Again, conjecture, but once the Trump team realizes that this is another piece of leverage against the PRC, they will, and more likely than not, increase the enforcement of it. Now, it'll be interesting to see how the administration handles a very stretched CBP and ICE. We're talking about mass deportations on day one. We're talking about looking at the southern border, continuing to build the wall, further deployment of CBP officials along that border. There's only so many folks that work within U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Trade facilitation, frontline facilitators at the major ports of entry, frankly, all ports of entry, be they sea or air, they will be stretched. That's also where UFLPA is being enforced. That's where the holds are being issued at the port level. Remember, UFLPA is not proactive in the sense that something is done prior to the shipment commencing. It is upon arrival at a U.S. port of entry. That's when it becomes an issue. But we do anticipate that this new administration will seize the opportunity to further enforce UFLPA. So for those of you online that have unfortunately been the subject to UFLPA holds and detentions, and even worse, gone through an applicability review, brace for impact. Our opinion is that it's only going to increase come January 20. Lastly, we flagged supply chains. We all know everything was upside down during the pandemic time. Part of that byproduct was a new piece of amendments to the shipping laws, primarily the Shipping Act of 1984, that provide that the Federal Maritime Commission, the FMC, become more of a consumer protection agency, protecting importers and exporters, U.S. importers and exporters, over the providers of the transport services, i.e. the ocean carriers. These laws are being implemented as we speak. The rules are being finalized. They are mostly done for a couple here and there. This is an outlier. I think we all agree that the rhetoric coming from the Trump team is a laissez-faire approach to government enforcement. Obviously, we've all talked about and we all heard about the DOGE in terms of the Department of Government Efficiency, Mr. Musk. There will be pockets like CBP, UFLPA, FMC, and implementation of these new changes to the Shipping Act from a couple years ago, where we do think there will be an uptick in, of all things, enforcement, even under a Trump team. So do not forget that there are other areas of trade concerns outside of tariff policy that you need to be mindful of. So on that, and I do apologize for rushing through it, I'll yield the rest to Mr. Nordwin here. And I do think we're going to try to spend some time doing questions and answers, but I think it's very important that you walk us through where you and Nick see the trade nominations. impacting policy.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. So just in terms of, keep hearing Ashley and Liz talk about the Trump team. So let's jump right into what we know so far about who the president has named as likely nominees, or in certain instances, appointees for the trade team. We're going to go through this pretty quickly. All of this has been fairly widely reported. So, at USTR, he has tapped Jamison Greer. He served as chief of staff to the former USTR, Bob Leitzinger, who served from 2017 to 2020. And Jamison's currently a partner in private practice, specializing in international trade. He's a former Air Force officer. And his legal career has included a significant role in litigation against China on behalf of a major U.S. Steel company. Next, Commerce Secretary nominee, Howard Lutnick. Maybe let me just stop for a second and say a lot of the discussion here in Washington is around, no matter who the trade team is, how much influence are they really going to have over President-elect Trump on trade and tariff issues? President-elect Trump has been very, as you know, outspoken. We've talked a lot about what he has said so far and very aggressive positions. There's no doubt concerns amongst many as to what the economic impact will be, both in terms of the tariffs implemented and the potential trade wars that might be commenced as a result. And the question on the table really is, how much influence will his trade team have over him in particular? And so these names here will be the ones who, to the extent there is any pushback or tempering and discussion internally, these are the ones who will be doing that. So we went to Howard Lutnick here for Commerce. Howard Lutnick is currently chairman and CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, and he's also serving as chairman of the Newmark Group, a Wall Street type. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He's an investor and key founder of Key Square Group. It's a macro hedge fund, global macro hedge fund company, and he's a former chief investment officer of Source Fund Management. We also have Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau. He served as the U.S. Ambassador to Mexico in the previous Trump administration. He was very instrumental in advancing key initiatives such as the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement and regional supply chain protections during the pandemic. We have Undersecretary of State for Economy and Growth, Jacob Helberg. He is a senior advisor at Palantir Technologies, a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and also a senior adjunct fellow at the Center for New American Security. Next slide, Ashton. The so-called border czar, Tom Homan. He served as an acting director of ICE from 2017 to 2018 in the previous administration, and he rose through the ranks from border patrol agent to the agency's top role. Very outspoken in terms of his views on border control. We have Kevin Hassett, who's been would be tapped as the National Economic Council chair. He served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the first administration, and then returned to the White House in 2020 to guide the economic response to the pandemic. He's served as a senior economist at the Federal Reserve as well. We have Rodney Scott, who would be head of the CBP. He served as the 24th chief of the U.S. Border Patrol in the previous Trump administration, and cycled in for a few months in the Biden administration. Next, we have at ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the director, Caleb Vitello. He's an assistant director in the Office of Firearms and Tactical Programs at ICE right now, and he has 23 years in federal law enforcement. And then, as many of you may remember, Pete Navarro, back on the team, senior counsel for trade and manufacturing. He served as director of the White House National Trade Council from December 2016 to April 2017, and subsequently as Director of Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy until the end of the Trump administration in January 2021. He's very well known for many years for his protectionist trade policies, and he strongly advocated for reducing U.S. trade deficits and imposing multilateral agreements like NAFTA and the TPA. Next slide, please. So then just a sense of who might be particularly busy in shuttle diplomacy, potentially. Nominees for Ambassador to Canada, former Congressman Pete Hoekstra from Michigan. He was also chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Ambassador to Mexico, Ronald Johnson, not the senator. Ronald Johnson is a retired U.S. Army colonel and is former U.S. ambassador to El Salvador. And then we have Ambassador to China, former senator from Georgia, David Perdue. And then finally, just for good measure, White House counsel, David Warrington. He is a corporate litigator and has been very involved in Republican politics, political law, that is. And he was also counsel to the 2016 Trump campaign during the Republican National Convention. So that is, generally speaking, the broad trade team. We're waiting for sub-cabinet picks to be named. But again, I think the big question is how much influence will those individuals have over the president, and how much will the president be really driving policy based on his own preconceived notions and announcements made so far. So then just a little housekeeping here. I don't need to read these to you, but just as we think through the questions I think remaining to be asked here in our remaining 3 or 4 minutes. These are the next in our series of upcoming webinars. Let me also mention, since we're toward the end, our CLE code again, for those who want it, is International 2024. That's International 2024. So let's go to the questions and see if there's anything left.
We have about 2 minutes. And I think Liz had a couple thoughts. And as I said earlier, we will respond to the questions as follow-up and make them available to all the attendees. But Liz, if you wanted to take the remaining 60 seconds here and do your very best to address WTO.
So there was a question about WTO disputes here. I think a couple of thoughts. One is the U.S. has sort of backed away a bit from WTO in recent years. So while disputes could be brought at the WTO, the effect that they will have is questionable. I know Ashley mentioned earlier USMCA, and obviously there are questions about how potential 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico sort of play under USMCA. The important thing to keep in mind is that USMCA has a national security carve-out. So if these tariffs against Canada and Mexico are based on IEEPA for national security purposes, then they would fall under the carve-out of USMCA. That said, I think I would expect both Canada and Mexico to initiate dispute proceedings. There's a separate dispute mechanism under USMCA. But much like other legal challenges, it takes a while, and that's not necessarily going to make a difference in the short term.
Go ahead.
Just one quick thing to supplement what Ashley mentioned on de minimis. I know there were lots of questions about that. I think we anticipate the reforms that the Biden administration has started to keep going forward, potentially to be wrapped up or at least sort of well down the road before the transition over to Trump. But as Ashley mentioned, I don't think that we see any backing away from de minimis reforms under the new administration.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Nick, and thank you, Will. We hope that those that attended found this to be insightful, useful, and ultimately practical. We tried to combine not only observations of the current political landscape impacting trade, tariffs, and related concerns, but drive, as you just heard from our partner, Liz Lowe, some, if you will, meaningful and ready to use recommendations. We will follow up with the questions that you presented to us, as I said, in writing in the coming days or so. And clearly, this is an issue that we will be following very closely, not only now, not only on the 20th of January, but well into next year. I think the only thing we can all agree on is that this is going to be a front and center issue. So thank you for joining us today, and we wish you all the best and a very happy holiday season to all. So thank you again for joining us.